Hello everyone, and welcome to another video from Core Academy of Sciences Creation Celebration. My name is Dr. Marcus Ross with Cornerstone Educational Supply in Lynchburg, Virginia. My background is in paleontology and geology. I'm a fossils and rocks guy, and I am delighted today to be able to talk about that very topic as we take a look at fossil tracks and traces in the rock record. So, there are a lot of evidences that the Earth is much younger than 4.5 billion years old. This is not to say that all the evidence always points in that direction. There are plenty of hard challenges for young Earth creationism. But among the ways in which we might be able to derive an age for the Earth, there's a surprising number that seem to point in the direction of a young Earth. Now, I don't have time to go through all these sorts of things today, so we're going to be picking two, looking at something called bioturbation, and we're also going to be looking at footprints. So two different ways in which the movements of organisms give us clues about how much time was in the fossil record. So starting off with bioturbation, or when organisms stir the sediment. Now, what? I mean, it's a weird word, bioturbation. Well, bio, that's life, and turbid or turbidity means when things are muddy or cloudy, soupy in a sense. You can't see through them. So the best way to think about bioturbation is to think about the ocean floor. And on the bottom of the ocean, there's a lot of sediment, and there's a lot of organisms that are living on and in that sediment. They're rummaging around through the mud and the sand looking for things to eat. So in the ocean, there's layers of sand and mud, and especially after like a hurricane comes through or a big storm, there will be lots and lots of layers that are made. And that's when the organisms get to work. As soon as the storm is done and over and all those layers are made, the organisms start moving around again. Some of them go vertical, up and down. Others tunnel around and through. Some of them dig a little and come back up. All these different types of organisms, like worms, shrimp, and clams, operate in their life in order to find food, and in so doing they obliterate all those layers. So you can see on the image here that we've got these light brown areas where those nice fine layers have all been stirred together, and you don't see much for layering. These are a couple of schematics and illustrations from the rock record about bioturbation from Leonard Brand and Art Chadwick's excellent book, Faith, Reason, and Earth History, a third volume. On the left-hand side, what we see is kind of an artist's schematic of different types of tracks, trails, and bioturbation marks made by organisms. There's U-shaped ones, such as worms that go in a U-shaped burrow. There are branching ones of things like shrimp that will go around and tunnel in different areas and have kind of a central nest. You've got clams that will dig vertically up and down, and other sorts of organisms, and all sorts of different ways in which they stir things up. You also have on the surface trackways, and on the lower left there is an example of a trackway that might get left by something like a trilobite. On the right-hand side are examples of the fossil record of, at the top in the letter C, very heavy bioturbation where most of the layering is gone. D, where there's only moderate bioturbation, most of the layers are there, and there's only occasional small disturbances. And then down at the bottom, E, an example where there's almost no bioturbation of any kind and all the layers are nicely preserved. So, what does this tell us when we see these different things in the fossil record? Well, if the Earth is ancient, we should expect that there should be very few finely layered sediments, because there are organisms everywhere and they are always busy looking for food. Yeah, there are a few places where organisms are rare, places where the oxygen levels are extraordinarily low, for example, but on the whole, those are marginal environments that don't contribute a huge volume of sediment, at least not in the modern world. And so if the present is the key to the past, as most of my old age colleagues think, then there really shouldn't be very many finely layered sediments. The organisms simply just tunnel through almost everything, especially in the near shore and offshore areas. So if the Earth is young, on the other hand, and most of the rock record was made during Noah's flood, then we should have fine layers preserved, and that is because there just isn't that much time as the layers are being made for organisms to stir it up. They're busy trying to survive and get up above the layers, but sometimes there's too many layers that are built up on top of them. They get squished and crushed, and you end up with a layer of fossils, right? And the organisms can't move because they're trapped under the weight of so much sediment. So young Earth creationists would expect that there would be very little bioturbation. Old Earth geologists would expect that there should be a lot. Now, as I mentioned, Leonard Brand and Art Chadwick, they've been starting on a long-term research program, and this is a little bit of what they've done that was published again in their book Faith, Reason, and Earth History. They started marching from the Grand Canyon north through Utah, looking at all the rock layers, about 10,000, 12,000 feet worth of it, and documenting what does bioturbation look like. And on the far left-hand side, let me get my laser pointer over here, we can find that there is bioturbation. These vertical black lines are the sections that they've measured. So they've measured a lot of rock going through here, and the little squiggly lines on the side are places where they have encountered some bioturbation in the form of things like burrows. Now, let's zoom in on the Triassic. This is the Moenkopi Formation, and in the Moenkopi Formation, what we find is that there is some bioturbation, but very, very little. The bioturbation seen in the Triassic Moenkopi Formation, which was average for their study, was all in Category 1, which was little to no bioturbation. Category 2 is moderate amounts, 3 is heavy, or 4 is extremely extensive. So in the entire Moenkopi Formation that they were able to measure, which was a lot, this is number of meters, so you're looking at 15,000, 16,000 feet worth of rock, they saw almost no bioturbation of any kind. And in C over here, this is bioturbation in the Cretaceous Mancos Shale, which was one of the most heavily bioturbated of all the rock units that they looked at. The vast majority of that was little to no bioturbation, occasionally moderate, and a few places severe bioturbation. And one of the things that they noticed was very interesting, and that was in the places where they had the highest amount of bioturbation, those were places near the top of a layer where conditions quickly changed before the next layer came in. So it was actually during a bit of a pause in the layering of sediment. So organisms don't have any time to do bioturbation in the bulk of this unit, except for when something changes and there's a little brief pause for a moment, then the organisms that are up top and can still move, they rummage around and then they get buried by something else. So this is a fascinating kind of situation here. Second part here is to take a look at footprints. Body fossils are the things that we consider most of the time when we talk about fossils. They're the physical hard remains of things like shells and teeth and bones and exoskeletons. Body fossils are abundant. There's lots of them because they're hard pieces, they're durable, and so they're easy to preserve. Tracks and trails, on the other hand, are much less easy to preserve because of their very temporary nature. Now, vertical bioturbation is pretty easy to do because when layers are made, animals start to go through them. But trackways like little walking trackways on top of a layer, those can easily be obliterated by currents and waves and things like that. So we see that there are organisms that are walking around on mud and sand, and the tracks are more rare because they're more delicate types of structures. They're not easy to keep around. If you've ever walked on a beach, you've left your foot tracks, and if it was on the dry sand, they get blown by the wind. If it was on the wet sand, the next waves come and take them away. So how can you preserve tracks? Well, again, we reach a place of divergence between young Earth and old Earth perspectives on this. If the Earth is ancient, then fossil footprints and trackways should generally be found above the bones and the hard parts of the track makers. Because if feet are easy to fossilize because they have bones in them or exoskeletons, then on average you should find those more frequently and therefore probably below any sort of trackways. So here we can envision a set of layers of sedimentary rocks. We've got abundant body fossils that are kind of found everywhere, and we have a sprinkling of occasional footprints that are fairly rare. But here's the thing, that's not always what we find in the fossil record. In fact, in many cases, there are millions of years, or putatively millions of years, between tracks and eventually the hard parts of the potential track makers. This begs the question, where are the feet that made the tracks? Let me give you a couple of examples. Trilobites are one of the most abundant invertebrate fossils on Earth. And the first appearance of trilobites in the fossil record is not the hard parts of trilobites, it is the trackways. And only in rocks above the trackways do we eventually find the hard pieces that we know are needed in order to make the tracks. There's a 10 million year difference, again according to conventional dating methods, in one of the best studied sections of trilobite fossils in Canada. We find that amphibian tracks, animals that have feet, that are vertebrates in this presumed fish to amphibian transition, amphibian tracks are found 30 million years before the track makers. So the bodies are found way, way after the amphibian tracks themselves. Turtle body fossils are found 25 million years after turtle tracks. And turtles are easy to fossilize because they are made of a giant bone shell. And when there are turtles in the fossil record, you know it. The little bits and pieces of those shells are everywhere. Dinosaur body fossils, for example, are also found a few million years after the first dinosaur trackways, and large theropod dinosaur tracks, the big meat eaters, are found 30 million years before the track makers. So we're seeing, for example, in the fossil record, little meat eaters in the track record and big tracks. And we don't find big track makers until way, way up above. If the Earth is young, on the other hand, and sediments form rapidly, and so we don't have millions of years between these, we actually only have a short window of time, this can make more sense of the data. For example, if rapid sediment accumulation is happening during the flood, this means that tracks and bodies have better odds of fossilization. It's not as lopsided for the body fossils as it is for the tracks. It's still more likely to be body fossils, but you've got better odds for both. And it also answers our track and body fossil gap answer. That is because animals are fleeing freshly laid sediment during the chaos of the flood. And before they are ultimately subsumed, those tracks are covered, and then their bodies are deposited on rocks above the ones that preserved the tracks themselves. So tracks are made by fleeing animals, and those animals are later caught up in floodwaters and deposited vertically above in the geological section. It's not millions of years, it's days, weeks, months, maybe. So when we take a look at these bits of evidence, what we find is that the evidence from bioturbation, animals stirring up the sediment as they tunnel around looking for food, this indicates that most of the geological record was laid down rapidly. There's very little bioturbation, and if the Earth is ancient, we should see gobs of it. If the Earth is young, there shouldn't be enough time for bioturbation, and so most of the sedimentary record should show nice layerings, and most of the time it does. The evidence from trackways indicates that there were short durations between the rocks that have the trackways and the rocks that have the track makers. So looking at these, a global flood at the time of Noah comports well. It makes sense of what we see in the geological record with the way that organisms behave under stress. And that is good to know. Right? It's one of those points of evidence that is in our column, in our favor, as young age creationists. So there are other things to talk about. There are plenty of other great presentations. I hope that you enjoy them as you enjoy the entirety of the creation celebration with Core Academy of Sciences. Be sure to like them on Facebook, to subscribe to their YouTube channels, and please remember to support them with your prayers and financial givings this year. The work that Core does is vital in helping train the next generation of creation researchers. I'm Dr. Marcus Ross with Cornerstone Educational Supply. May the Lord bless you, keep you, make his face shine upon you, may he give you peace. God bless.